Hi, my name's Venetia. I was 9 when my parents packed a bag for me and drove me to a stranger's house in the middle of nowhere. They said they needed to focus their energy on my twin sister. They didn't die. They didn't move away. They just erased me. Quietly, neatly. But even after a decade of silence, they still used my name, on tax returns, on paperwork, to keep up the story that I never left. Last night, I invited them to dinner. I didn't do it to reconnect. I did it so they could watch the life I built, without them. But what happens when the truth is louder than their version ever was? And what if the name they gave me was never really mine? The knock on the door came right on time, sharp, not hesitant. I didn't rush to answer it. I let the echo roll across the hardwood floors, past the carefully set dining table, past the baby toys in the corner, until it faded into silence. When I finally opened the door, my mother stepped in first, her heels clacking against the tile like she owned the place. My father followed, carrying nothing, not even guilt. They looked around like they had walked into a showroom, not a home. "Is the owner here?" my mother asked, already halfway through the living room. I didn't flinch. I didn't laugh either. "You're in her house," I said. She froze. Her eyes flicked to mine, then back to the framed family photos on the wall. None of them included her. The tension hung heavy, like humid air before a storm. 10 years of silence doesn't fill itself. It hovers between every word, every breath. I didn't invite them here for closure. This wasn't a reunion. This was a reckoning. They took seats at the table without asking. Of course they did. My father cleared his throat, glancing at the meal in front of him, but making no move to touch it. "You've done well for yourself," he offered. That generic tone, as if I'd won a local raffle, not rebuilt a life from scratch. "I get by," I said, folding a napkin, smoothing it once, then again. They glanced at the baby stroller by the stairs. My son was asleep upstairs. I wasn't going to wake him for this. "How long have you lived here?" my mother asked, her tone just shy of polite. "Long enough for it to feel like mine." No one responded. No one needed to. And yet, I could feel them scanning, noticing the details. The framed law degree, the matching chairs, the lack of dust. They were searching for proof of wealth, of independence, of their own absence. That's when the memory hit me. It was Christmas. I was 15. My sister's friends had come to visit from her private prep school. I'd been told to stay out of sight. "Just help your aunt with food," my mother had said. One of the girls spilled juice on the rug and turned to me. "Could you grab a towel, please?" she asked. "You work here, right?" I remember standing there, too stunned to speak. I wasn't in uniform. I wasn't carrying trays. But I guess my presence alone, in that house, with that face, didn't scream, "Daughter." My mother didn't correct her. She didn't say a word. She smiled and turned back to her wine. That was the last party I ever showed up to in their house. Not because I was banned, but because I finally understood I was never invited. I looked across the table now, watching them pretend nothing ever happened. My mother folded her hands neatly in her lap. My father checked his phone, like this was just another appointment to sit through. "So, do you live here alone?" he asked, eyes lingering on the pictures again. "Not alone," I said. "Just not with people who left me." My voice was even, steady, not bitter. The kind of quiet that doesn't shake, but sinks in deep. He didn't ask anything else. I rose from my seat slowly, walked toward the cabinet at the far end of the room. They both watched as I opened it, pulled out a small silver picture frame, and returned to the table. Without a word, I placed it directly between their plates. In the photo, me, my newborn son, my sister Isolde, standing behind us, arms wrapped around my shoulders. My mother's breath hitched. My father blinked. But neither of them touched the frame. They stared at the photo for a long time, long enough for me to set the plates down one by one, without either of them acknowledging my movement. Only Isolde rose from her chair. She helped without asking. We moved around each other with practiced rhythm, like we had done this 100 times before. No talking, just small gestures that meant more than words ever could. My mother's eyes stayed fixed on the picture. Her mouth was tight, her hands clutched together like she was trying to wring the memory out of her skin. My father leaned back in his seat, blinking slowly, jaw working, but still not saying a damn thing. As I placed the last plate, I caught Isolde's glance. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a warning. It was just her way of saying, "I'm here." The air felt heavy again, and not because of the food. It was something else, like opening a door and letting in a draft you've spent years sealing up. I sat down across from them, watching their reactions. My mother finally asked, "So, you and Isolde are still close?" I didn't even blink. We never stopped. She looked down, as if that answer hurt more than it should have. But it wasn't always like this. It used to be worse. So much worse. I remembered one winter, 11 years old, I think. A box had arrived. Brown cardboard, cheap tape, and inside, a red sweater, thick and soft. It smelled faintly of perfume and starch. I remember lifting it up, holding it to my chest, thinking, "Maybe this year?" She remembered. There was a note inside. "Keep it clean. Your sister will need it for pictures." I wore it once, just to see how it felt. I didn't spill anything, didn't sweat in it, didn't even let the sleeves stretch. Then I folded it and tucked it away in the dresser, like it had never touched me. It wasn't mine. It was never meant to be. Not the sweater, not the room, not the attention. It wasn't about the gift. It was about the message. You don't deserve new things. You're just holding space until she shows up. I learned early how to disappear without leaving, but not from Isolde. She was the only one who found ways to find me. She used the old landline in Dad's office, calling when she knew he was out or asleep. We'd whisper about schoolwork, songs we liked, made-up stories we'd never share with anyone else. We never talked about the house, or our parents. Not until one night when she broke down. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "I'm sorry they treat you like background noise. Like you're just the wall around my stage." And I didn't say anything to make her feel better. I didn't need to, because I knew she meant it. That apology stayed with me more than any gift ever could. Now, tonight, watching her pour water for people who still acted like guests in my life, they weren't family anymore, not really. I realized just how much she had carried all those years. When she moved beside me again, she gently tapped my wrist, a silent cue. I stood, walked over to the sideboard, and unzipped the leather folder I had tucked away after they arrived. The same one I had pulled from my bag earlier that morning. Inside were the letters, 10 of them, each dated, each written in my child's handwriting, desperate to stay connected. I had sent them after they left me in that tiny house with my great-aunt. I had written about my classes, the chickens, the way the roof leaked when it rained. I asked for birthday cards. I told them when I lost my first tooth out there. I begged them to come visit, even just once. None of them had ever been answered. But I kept writing. Hope's a stupid kind of stubborn when you're that young. I pulled one letter from the folder. The first one. Folded 3 times, yellowed with time. I slid it across the table toward my mother. Isolde looked down at it, her hands folded tightly in her lap now. "You remember these?" I asked, not needing a reply. "You never wrote back. But I figured if I sent them somewhere, they'd live longer than I would in your memory." My mother didn't touch it. Her fingers twitched like she wanted to, but she didn't. "They were never thrown away," I added, staring straight at her. "You just didn't open them." Her voice was low when it finally came. "You don't understand what was going on back then." "No," I cut in gently. "I don't. Because you never thought I mattered enough to explain anything." There was no screaming. No plates flying across the room. Just a growing silence that pressed down on everyone. Isolde stood behind me again, close enough that I felt her presence. She still hadn't said a word, but I could sense she was holding back tears. "You kept every single one?" she whispered. All of them. And I meant it. Not just the letters, but the memories, the rejections, the nights I stared out the window of a house I didn't belong to, wondering if they even remembered my name. I turned slightly and looked at my sister. You remember the letters I used to send you? Her eyes shimmered, a small nod. Then I reached into the folder once more, pulled out a sealed envelope, thicker, cleaner, and slid it across the table. Not to my sister, but to my mother. She stared at it like it was made of fire. I've kept all the things you threw away, I said calmly, and I brought them back, just for tonight. She didn't touch the envelope. Not with her hands, not with her eyes. She just let it sit there like it might catch fire if she so much as acknowledged its weight. I wasn't disappointed. I had already braced myself for that reaction. It takes a certain kind of pride to throw something away and still pretend it never existed, even when it's placed right in front of you, sealed and labeled in your own handwriting. I watched my mother carefully slide the envelope aside, close enough to her purse that it might disappear by the time dessert came, but not so close that anyone could accuse her of caring. I smiled. Tight. Tired. But not cruel. Some people would rather lose everything than admit they discarded the wrong thing. The sight of her ignoring it brought something old and unwelcome back to the surface. I could see the back seat of that car again, cloth upholstery with a tear in the middle. My legs were too short to touch the floor. I remember pressing my palms to the seat beside me, bracing as the car bumped over potholes. I was 9. They had packed my things in silence. No one argued. No one cried. They told me we were going on a little trip. My sister stayed home. There were 2 trash bags full of my clothes and a duffel bag that still smelled like chlorine from swim lessons. No favorite toy. No goodbye hug. Just my mother glancing back once in the rearview mirror. One of you is going to be somebody, she had said. We have to focus our resources. She didn't say which one, but it didn't need to be said. I didn't argue. I nodded. I thought if I agreed, if I showed them I understood, they'd see how good I could be. That maybe they'd change their minds halfway there and turn around. They didn't. We drove for hours. They didn't play music. They didn't ask how I was feeling. At one point, I asked if I'd still be home for my birthday. My father said, "We'll see." He knew, she knew. I didn't. The gravel road that led to my great-aunt's house was mostly dirt, the kind that clings to your shoes and makes the air thick. The fence was leaning. The windows were covered in plastic sheeting instead of glass. They didn't get out of the car when we pulled up. My mother rolled down the window, called out my aunt's name like she was yelling for a cab. When the door opened, I was handed the duffel bag and both trash bags at once. No instructions, no blessing. Just a, "You be good now," and a door that clicked shut behind me. I watched the taillights disappear, long after the sound of the engine was gone. I waited an extra few minutes, just in case. Maybe they forgot something. Maybe this was a test. They didn't come back. That was the last time I saw them in person until tonight. It wasn't abandonment with shouting or slammed doors. It was worse. It was neat, quiet, practiced. Like they'd already rehearsed it once before, and this time, they finally got it right. Back in the present, I could feel my hands clenched under the table. The smell of roasted chicken hung in the air, untouched. The glasses were sweating. Condensation trickled down the sides. Still, nobody reached for water. My father broke the silence. Not with an apology. Of course not. "We're glad to see you've done something with yourself," he said, like he was commenting on weather or stocks. I didn't blink. I didn't look at him. "It's easier when no one's grading you anymore," I replied. That got his attention. He leaned back, exhaled through his nose. My mother shifted in her seat, finally adjusting her posture as if she'd just remembered she wasn't at a charity luncheon. Her gaze swept the room, photos, furniture, details she likely didn't expect from someone she'd once called a burden. She had that look people get when they walk into a room and realize they underestimated it. like she thought this dinner would be held in a duplex, not a home with vaulted ceilings and frame certifications. I let the moment stretch. I wanted them to see everything they weren't part of. The bottle of wine Otis had brought, the monogrammed bib draped over the edge of the high chair, the still burning candle in the middle of the table. Every inch of that room had something they had no hand in creating. My son's giggle echoed from upstairs. The conversation halted. My father's mouth twitched like he was going to say something about him. I shot him a glance sharp enough to halt that thought in its tracks. Don't. Not him. I tapped my fork gently against the plate. Not enough to startle, but enough to make their heads turn. Then I said it. Do you remember what you said to me before you left that day? No one answered. My father looked down. My mother didn't even pretend to think. So I sat up straighter, met their silence with steel in my spine. Because I remember every word, and if you don't, I'll repeat it, louder. My words didn't echo. They just sat there, heavy and direct. The kind of truth that didn't ask for space. It took it. My father stared at his glass of water, like it held the answer. My mother shifted in her seat, repositioning her napkin with sudden focus, as if that piece of folded fabric could shield her from what I'd just said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I simply said the sentence they once gave me, wrapped in practicality, hidden behind the polished language of ambition. The kind of sentence you remember not because it was shouted, but because it ended something. One of you is going to be somebody. We have to focus our resources. That was what they told me, and now I watched it land. They didn't deny it. Not even a flinch. I let the silence linger for a beat longer, then leaned back in my chair. Not smug, not vengeful, just steady. Let them sit in it for once. But my mind wasn't in that room anymore. Not entirely. It drifted, pulled backward to a summer that still left blisters on my palms. Isolde had just gotten selected for some prestigious academic camp out of state, something about advanced placement and early college credit. They celebrated with cake. My mother cried proud tears. My father called everyone he knew to tell them how brilliant his daughter was. That same week, I was knee-deep in mud helping Aunt V fix irrigation hoses in the back acre of her land. The sun was brutal. The water pump kept stalling. I sliced my finger on rusted wire and wrapped it in a torn bandana without saying a word. Aunt V handed me a thermos and said, "Some kids are born to shine. Some are born to survive." I didn't take it as an insult. I just nodded and drank. I didn't cry that day. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I already knew tears were a waste when no one was watching. The memory faded as I heard the clink of silverware in the present. My father tried to act casual, like he hadn't just heard his own line used as a mirror. "You've got some nice pieces in here," he said, motioning toward the decor. "Where'd you get that lamp?" He was trying to steer the ship back to safer waters, but I wasn't offering any oars. "Gift," I said, "from someone who believed I could be something without needing to prove it." He gave a small nod, like he'd missed the jab entirely. Or maybe he got it and just chose not to show it. That's when my mother finally spoke again. "So, college?" she asked, feigning interest. I felt my chest tighten, not from pain, but from restraint. "I wanted to go," I replied evenly. "You didn't want to help." She blinked. "That's not true." "You wouldn't sign the FAFSA forms," I said, keeping my tone flat. "You said it would be a waste. You said I'd drop out." She opened her mouth, then closed it. I continued. "I applied anyway. Miss LaRue from the school office helped me after hours. We faxed the forms together from the front desk." My father frowned. "You never told us. You never asked." There it was again. That old game they loved to play. Selective amnesia, faux surprise. Like if they just kept pretending not to know, they wouldn't have to face the truth that they chose to disappear. "It wasn't about the degree," I added, my voice softening just a touch. "It was about not vanishing." I looked down at my hands. Older now, steadier. Back then, they had been raw from working summers in fields and washing laundry by hand. I had studied at night by the window with a flashlight when the power got cut. I wrote essays on borrowed paper and rode the bus 45 minutes each way just to get to class. I didn't care about honors. I just wanted a seat in the room, one they never saved for me. My father leaned forward. "What's the name of that town we sent you to again?" The question hit differently. It wasn't that he didn't know, it was that he had never bothered to remember. I tilted my head, stared at him like I was seeing him for the first time. "You don't remember?" I asked. He hesitated. "It was something Creek?" My mother interjected, annoyed. "Why does it matter now?" I turned to her. "Because that's where I learned how to be someone you couldn't destroy." Her lips parted, but she didn't answer. She looked like she wanted to argue, like she wanted to say it was never that serious. But even she knew better. I stood. I walked to the cabinet near the hallway, opened the drawer slowly. I had placed the second envelope there earlier in the day, knowing this moment would come. When I returned, I didn't drop it. I placed it gently next to my father's plate. He stared at it. The white edge glared back at him. "You might recognize some of those signatures." His hands didn't move. And yet, the silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. He didn't reach for the envelope, not because he was unsure of what it contained, but because he already knew. His silence wasn't confusion. It was confirmation. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. The documents were self-explanatory. Copies of emails, notarized financial records, voided check stubs, every time they had promised help and backed out, every refusal to fund my education while simultaneously sending Isolde tuition and allowance. I sat back in my chair, adjusted my napkin, and waited. Then came the knock. Sharp, 3 deliberate taps. I stood slowly, walked toward the front door, and opened it without a word. Otis Landor stepped inside. He didn't need an introduction, but the way my father's eyes narrowed told me he had either not recognized him immediately or hoped he never would. Otis removed his cap with the same quiet dignity that marked everything he did. His shoulders were broader now than I remembered, but he still carried himself with the same calm, like a man who had seen the worst of people and chosen not to mirror it. My mother stiffened. Her expression told me she hadn't expected this part of the evening. Her face stretched into something that attempted to resemble polite curiosity. It didn't reach her eyes. Otis walked past her, nodding to my sister, who rose slightly in her seat out of habit, then sat again. He reached the end of the table, stopped behind my father's chair, and looked at him plainly. "This one you threw away?" he said, gesturing toward me. "She builds people, not empires, people." My father didn't respond. His jaw tensed. Otis wasn't done. "You fired me for handing her a book, said I was getting too familiar, that she needed boundaries? I thought you meant protection. I didn't realize you meant confinement." My mother spoke before my father could. "This isn't the time or place." Otis didn't even look at her. "Maybe if you had made time back then, this place wouldn't feel so foreign to you now." He turned to me and offered a small nod. I returned it, letting the power of the moment sit. Otis had always had a way of saying very little and leaving a crater behind. And then I could feel it. That shift. The power in the room no longer belonged to them. I stood and walked to the side buffet. From underneath a stack of placemats, I pulled a thin black binder. "This," I said, placing it gently on the table, "is the revised will." "Yours?" My mother gasped. "I found the original copy last year when Aunt V passed. She still had her records. Back when you made me her responsibility, you included financial support. But more than that, I was listed as a beneficiary." My father looked like he'd been hit with cold water. "You weren't supposed to see that." "No," I replied. "I wasn't. That was the point, wasn't it?" He opened his mouth again, but I raised a hand. "I don't care about the money," I said, voice steady. "I just needed proof I was ever included at all." My mother's voice was small. "We didn't think you'd..." survive long enough to need it. That stung, more than I thought it would. I laughed, not bitterly, just hollow. The kind of laugh you let out when you're finally too tired to cry. Well, I said, I did. Otis took a step forward, offering my father a short, direct glance. She didn't just survive. She built a life out of nothing, and not just for herself. I turned and walked to the bar cart. The room had gone still. Even my son's soft babbling from upstairs felt like a hymn. I poured myself a glass of wine, turned back, and raised it. How does it feel? I asked my father. To sit in a house you didn't help build, at a table you never earned a seat at? The silence turned sharp. My father didn't answer. Not because he couldn't. Because for the first time in his life, he knew better than to try. I didn't sit down after the toast. Instead, I stood behind my chair, both hands lightly gripping the top rail like I was anchoring myself in a storm I'd prepared for. The silence thickened again. Not the awkward kind. The kind that knows it's being watched. My father's eyes stayed locked on the envelope he refused to touch. My mother reached for her glass, with fingers that trembled more than she wanted anyone to see. I let it breathe. The tension, the weight. Then I moved forward. No one's here to shame you, I said, voice low but unmistakably firm. I invited you to witness. There's a difference. She blinked slowly, her lips moving just enough to form. You invited us here to humiliate us? No, I said, pausing just long enough. I invited you to watch. I slid a new document across the table, this time directly toward her. A single page, photocopied, highlighted in yellow. A 1098 T form. She scanned it without touching it. Her eyes widened just slightly before narrowing again. That's, she started. My tax form, I finished. Filed under my name, claimed by you. Her face twisted into the same shape it made when I used to spill juice on the carpet as a child. Controlled disapproval. You didn't call me for 10 years, I said, stepping closer to the table. But you filed me. Isolde looked down into her lap. Otis stood quietly near the corner of the room, arms crossed, expression unreadable. I leaned my palms gently against the table, voice still level. You didn't raise me. You didn't check in. But when it was tax season, suddenly I existed again. My mother's voice dropped. It was just a clerical thing. We thought... No, I cut her off. Not with volume, but with clarity. You thought no one would notice. You thought I wouldn't matter enough to file for myself. You didn't expect me to build a life that required a credit report. That was the crack. The mask started slipping, and I wasn't finished. I stepped back and let my memory do what it always had, file and retrieve. 2 years ago, middle of March, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring twice before answering. Venetia? My mother's voice had come through tinny, rehearsed. Hey, honey. Listen, there's a small thing with the IRS. They flagged something from last year, and it's probably nothing, but they want a signature from you on a clarification form. Can I email it? That call had lasted under 5 minutes. She never asked how I was. Never asked where I lived. Never once mentioned my son. But she wanted a signature. I didn't sign. But I saved the voicemail. She had said, You don't have to read the whole thing. It's just a quick sign and send. You'll be doing us a favor. We've always looked out for you, you know? I replayed that message more than once. Not out of pain, but out of sheer disbelief. The voice of a woman who had erased me from her life for a decade, now calling to tell me I owed her one. Tonight, I let the silence speak for me again. I didn't even know you still had my number, I said now, looking at her. Funny how I became reachable once paperwork was involved. My father's hand was flat against the table now. The knuckles were pale. He didn't look at me. I was applying for a mortgage, I continued. That's how I found it. Multiple returns, years worth. You claimed me as a dependent until I was 23. I turned to him now. That's fraud, by the way. financially and legally. He shifted, eyes darting to my mother. We weren't doing anything malicious. You were doing something convenient, I said. Let's call it what it was. Otis stepped forward, setting a manila folder gently on the table. They didn't just claim her, he said calmly. They withheld thousands in tax credits. That's theft. My mother's mouth opened again, ready to protest, but she saw something in my face that made her close it. I walked to the head of the table, pulled out the final folder. It was heavier. I placed it in front of them. I haven't filed charges, I said. Yet. But I have spoken to a lawyer, and he's very interested in the paper trail. My father finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. You wouldn't. I smiled, not sweetly. This dinner, I said, this is me being generous. No one spoke. For the first time all night, they didn't interrupt. They didn't argue. They didn't offer a single excuse. I let it sit. Then I pulled my chair back, slow and smooth, and sat down. I made this meal for you because I needed you to understand one thing, I said, folding my hands neatly. I am not the girl you sent away. I am the woman who came back without needing anything from you. Isolde reached for the water pitcher, quietly refilling her glass. She didn't say a word, but I saw the way her shoulders relaxed. This wasn't about revenge. This was about balance, truth, precision. My mother looked smaller now, not in stature, but in presence. She picked up the edge of the first document and began to read, finally. But I was already done talking. My father's fingertips hovered near the edge of the folder, but he didn't reach for it, not yet. My mother sat rigid, jaw locked tight, like she was chewing glass behind her lips. That's when I reached down beneath my chair and pulled out the small black remote I'd kept hidden beneath the napkin on my lap. I pressed the power button. The TV mounted on the wall lit up slowly, reflecting in their glasses like a courtroom screen. I think it's time we heard from the one voice you always did listen to, I said. Isolde. Their heads turned toward the screen, and I watched the exact moment when they realized what was coming. I hadn't warned them, because the truth, unlike apologies, doesn't need an invitation. The screen flickered to a well-lit room. A woman, my sister, sat against a plain background, hair pulled back, eyes tired but steady. 2 years ago, she'd been asked to speak in a documentary series that focused on family estrangement. She called me before agreeing. They want me to talk about our story, she said over the phone, but I'll only do it if you say it's okay. I don't need you to protect me, I told her. I just need you to be honest. She nodded through the phone line, and a week later, she recorded her interview. That clip was never released publicly. Until tonight. The room fell completely silent as her voice filled the space. My sister was never dumb, she said. She just wasn't who they wanted. My mother blinked rapidly. She was kind, creative, quiet, but in our house, none of that counted unless it looked good on a resume. The footage cut to her hands, fidgeting with a ring on her thumb. They called her a burden, said she was average, too soft, too emotional, but I called her my compass. The screen cut back to her face. I didn't always do enough. I stayed quiet longer than I should have, and I regret that. My mother covered her mouth with both hands, her body shaking, not with grief, but with fear. She glanced at me like she might beg me to turn it off. I didn't. My father reached forward as if to grab the remote, but I held up my hand. You watched me walk away, I said softly. The least you can do is watch me speak. The video continued. She wrote to me every week, Isolde said. From the day they sent her away to that house until the day she stopped hoping they'd write back. I read every word, and I kept them. I could feel my throat tighten, not from sadness, but from the way those words landed, full and solid. The camera in the video zoomed in slowly. She looked straight into the lens and said, "She deserved better, and the world deserves to know what being not smart enough meant in our family." The screen faded to black. No credits, No music. Just silence. My mother's face had gone pale. She wasn't crying now, just frozen, like a statue made of guilt. "You did this to shame us?" she asked, voice cracking. I shook my head. "No, I did this to remind myself I wasn't imagining it." My father stood slowly, hands on the table like he needed the support. He didn't leave the room, just shifted his weight like a man realizing he couldn't walk away from a thing that lived in public memory now. He looked at the photo frame again, the one still sitting between their plates. Then he looked at Otis. Otis didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His presence alone was a reminder that the life I'd built hadn't come from their guidance. It had grown in spite of it. "You didn't just lose a daughter," I said, breaking the quiet. "You lost the chance to know her." My mother finally lowered her hands. Her eyes were wet but dry of remorse. "You always misunderstood us." "No," I said. "I understood you perfectly. I just stopped believing it was my job to keep earning your love." The room exhaled, like it had been holding its breath. I stood, walking slowly toward the door, not to leave, but to breathe away from the heat of that moment. Halfway there, I turned back. "You always loved her more," I said, not bitter, just factual. "But she loved me enough to tell the truth." My mother flinched like it was a slap. My father didn't move. And that's when it hit me. They had lost the story. For years, they'd been the ones who got to tell it. At church, at dinner parties, at reunions. They got to shape the narrative. One daughter brilliant, one gone. One worth investing in, the other quietly forgotten. Not anymore. Tonight, the world saw what I saw. And I decided, quietly, completely, that the name they gave me no longer belonged to them. I didn't leave the room after that final sentence. I didn't need to. The power had already shifted. I could feel it in the way their eyes avoided mine. I returned to my seat, not looking for confirmation, not even for understanding. Just stillness. Closure, maybe. I bent slightly and pulled the last folder from beneath my chair. A thin gray one, plain, unassuming, but heavier than the rest in consequence. I placed it on the table beside the wine glass I hadn't touched in a while. "You took away my name," I said, voice even. "So I made it official." My mother blinked slowly, as if her brain had to reroute just to make sense of what I said. My father turned toward the folder like it might explode if he touched it. Inside were 3 documents, one for identity, one for legality, and one for accountability. The first was the legal certificate confirming my name change, from Venetia Ruth Winslow to Venetia Ruth Landor. No middle initial borrowed from my mother. No last name passed down from a father who'd washed his hands of me. Just me. Claimed, not given. The second was a cease and desist letter addressed to them both, courtesy of my lawyer. It outlined the misuse of my name, the unauthorized tax filings, the reputational harm caused by telling people I had disappeared, when really, I was just never called. And the third, a printed summary from the fraud investigation I had quietly opened months ago. Not a lawsuit. Not yet. But a file. An official inquiry. Something that would follow them into the financial corners of their life if they ever thought about rewriting the narrative again. My mother reached for her chest, the heel of her palm resting just beneath her collarbone. "You'd drag us through this? Legally?" my father finally asked, his voice stripped of arrogance now, thin like rice paper. "No," I answered. "You dragged me through this emotionally, for decades. This is just paper." He sat back slowly. My mother didn't speak. I unfastened the clasp on the folder and turned it around so it faced them. "I didn't do it for revenge," I said. "I did it because I needed a life that didn't belong to people who chose not to be in mine." The room was still warm, but my skin felt cool, like something tight had finally released in my chest. 2 months ago, I'd sat in a small legal office in downtown Jackson. It wasn't grand, just 2 desks, mismatched chairs, and a humming window unit. But it was quiet. Safe. The clerk had peered over her glasses, tapping her keyboard. "Reason for the name change?" she asked. I didn't hesitate. "Because I earned a name of my own." She looked up, didn't ask anything else. She printed the form. When I signed the line, I thought I'd feel triumphant. Instead, I felt something deeper. Like the ground under my feet had shifted just slightly. Like the weight I carried had finally been shared by the earth itself. Venetia Ruth Landor. It fit. Not like a costume or a disguise, but like skin. And now, back at the dinner table, I looked at the people who had once taught me how small I could be. They had no voice left in the room, no version of the story they could reclaim. Even Isolde was silent now. She stared at the edge of her plate, eyes shining, but not crying. My father cleared his throat, trying again. "We didn't think you'd make it. Out there." I turned toward him, not angry, not wounded, just aware. "You told me I had no legacy," I said. "But I built one. You just weren't invited." There was no retaliation in my tone, no venom, only truth, and it was louder than any accusation I could have thrown. Otis looked over at me and gave a single nod, like a man who understood what it meant to win quietly. I stood again, but this time it wasn't to make a point. I walked over to the guest room door, eased it open, and scooped up my son. He stirred a little, blinked, then curled against my shoulder. As I walked back through the dining room, I paused beside Otis and gently touched his arm. He followed me toward the front. I turned back once, not for drama, but for clarity. "This house is mine," I said. "This name is mine. And this silence? Also mine." My father didn't move. My mother looked as though she wanted to speak, but knew better now. The name they'd once given me had been a mark of ownership, a tag, an assumption that I'd always be less. But Venetia Ruth Landor wasn't theirs. It was mine. And as I stepped out that door, I didn't feel angry. I just felt done. The front door closed softly behind me. Not a slam, not a statement, just a quiet seal on a night that had been a decade in the making. I carried my son upstairs, his weight pressing warm against my chest. He was half awake, his tiny fingers curled around the strap of my dress like he'd never let go. I kissed his temple as I laid him in his crib, then stood for a long moment at the edge of the bed, watching his chest rise and fall. There was no storm left in me, no adrenaline, just calm, the kind that settles in after a long fight when there's nothing left to swing at. Downstairs, the silence of the house wrapped around me, not the cold, echoing kind I used to dread, but something gentler, steady, like a body that had finally taken a full breath. I walked through each room slowly, barefoot on hardwood. The framed documents were still on the table. The envelope unopened. The TV dark again. A used fork rested beside a still full plate. My father's water glass was empty. They had left quietly. I hadn't heard the door close. By the time I reached the kitchen, the sun had started to press gently against the edge of the blinds. Not quite morning, but no longer night. I filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and leaned back against the counter. My phone buzzed. A message. Just a line. "We won't fight the papers. Do what you need to. D." No apology, no explanation, just surrender. I stared at it for a long second, then forwarded it to my lawyer, typed one sentence, "As discussed, proceed," and hit send. Then I deleted the original text. Not out of anger, not revenge, but finality. Isolde came by mid-morning. She didn't knock, just let herself in the way people do when they know they're welcome. She didn't bring up the dinner. She didn't have to. We just stood in the kitchen for a while, both of us barefoot, both of us holding warm mugs like shields. She was the one who broke the quiet. "I didn't sleep." "Neither did I," I said. We sat at the counter, elbows brushing. No makeup, no small talk. Just breathing in the same space again. "Why did you keep talking to them?" I asked finally, not accusing, just curious. Isolde rubbed her thumb along the edge of her mug. "Because I couldn't lose both of you. That answer sat between us, raw but not sharp. You always had choices, I said. I did, she nodded. And I chose badly, at first. But I never stopped loving you, Ven. I didn't respond right away. I wasn't ready to say, I love you too. Not yet. But I placed my hand over hers and gave it a squeeze. We cleaned up the dishes together. She folded the napkins neatly, the way Mom used to do at holidays. I rinsed the glasses. There was no rush, just rhythm. Later that afternoon, after she left, I took my son outside. He toddled barefoot in the backyard, chasing the dog, laughing so freely I felt my ribs loosen. He stopped by the wooden block said Otis had made him last Christmas. It was simple, smooth squares, arches, and ramps, but my son played with it like it held magic. Because to him, it did. He stacked a tower with surprising precision, then looked up at me with a grin. Did I do good, Mama? I crouched down and cupped his face. You don't have to do anything to be good, I whispered. You're already enough. He blinked at me, then turned back to his blocks. And just like that, I felt the wound shift again. Not disappear, but shift. That's the thing about scars. They don't vanish, but they stop hurting when you touch them. By evening, I sat at the kitchen table alone, a cup of tea in hand, a quiet house around me. I glanced at the drawer where I'd kept all the documents, then at the fireplace where the old family photo used to hang. I had taken it down years ago. Now, only a single frame sat on the mantel. Me and my son, his hand in mine, the wind in our hair. I traced the rim of my mug with one finger, then looked out the window. The trees barely moved. The sun had dipped behind the roofline, softening everything in amber light. I thought about the girl I had been, sitting on a porch in a strange town, holding letters no one answered. I thought about the woman I had become, seated at her own table, in her own home, with a name she chose. Some wounds don't close, but they stop bleeding, and for now, that's enough.